Welcome to SommBox, with today's topic requiring very little introduction. I think if there is one vineyard in Burgundy which is sure to get the pulse racing at the mere mention of it, it's probably Vosne-Romanee. Of course, the village that is home to maybe the most expensive wine in the world, Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, and several others for that matter, is certainly the holy grail for any Burgundy drinker or aspiring Burgundy expert. And the fact is, it's deserved. I've mentioned Vosne is a village with an incredible amount of great terroir, but there is no other village in Burgundy, or maybe even in any other wine growing region in the world, where so many absolutely incredible, phenomenal, amazing terroirs can be packed within such a tight proximity. Even the village wines of Vosne-Romanée are on a higher level than most other Premier Crus you could think of, from a great producer, of course, in a great vintage. What I'm trying to say is the bar is simply set very high. So if you look at a wine list and you see a Village Vosne-Romanée, which seems a little bit pricey, well, of course it does. What you get out of a Vosne village is incredible. Of course, like any other village, there are going to be some not so great producers, some pretty okay producers, some great producers, and some holy crap, that just changed my life producers, right? But the margin of error is very small when you're talking about so many names with so little land, all making wine right next to each other. I mean, the difference can be very obvious and painfully so if you deign to make a wine here and not at least try to keep up with the Joneses, you know? So if it seems odd that in this particular box, maybe unlike the other Burgundy boxes, there are 4 Village Vosnes and then 2 single vineyards, well, this is why. Don't be surprised. The most invaluable thing that I could probably show you with this box is not just to give you an overview of Vosne. Of course, I will do that in another box, and it'll probably cost a pretty penny too. But what I wanted to show here is also the wonderful ageability of Vosne-Romanée, one of the most timeless wines which Pinot Noir has ever known as a grape in any interpretation or location all over the world. And its evolution is stunning, even on the village level. So I wanted to walk you through the 16 to the 12, jumping to the 2000 and the 96, all from absolutely epic producers, to show you the different stages of what these magical grapes go through on their path to aged glory. So 16, obviously very youthful now, showing its richness of fruit and its sort of more exotic, seductive qualities, giving it truly that moniker, iron fist in a velvet glove, as Vosne-Romanée is normally known. Such a firm, rock solid, so steely core that's just wrapped in this almost velour-like impression on the palate. It has the presence of a freight train steaming through the countryside at night with this one beacon of light in front of it, piercing the black. But it's almost silent. It's that velvetiness on the palate, that quality of fruit that's so dark and smoldering and sumptuous and seductive, combined with a structure that's something like a castle would be made out of, and equally as timeless. So to show you how this goes through is a really unique opportunity. From the 16, moving along to 12, from Jean Griveaux. Tasting at Jean Griveaux, especially with the Father Etienne, was for me always like being in church. From his rooftops, you look down upon Richebourg, and you know exactly where you are, smack in the middle of the greatest Pinot Noir village on the planet. Then you descend into the cellars with these thick walls in the chill morning air. You can almost see your breath, and there's little beams of divine light filtering in through the little slitty windows in the cellar. And it has this aroma of damp stone, almost, I guess my mind was imagining it, but maybe it's my Catholic school upbringing in cathedrals, but you could almost smell the myrrh and the frankincense. And he speaks so deliberately, but rarely, with intention and quietly, and with a firmness. And if you talk too much, he will say to you, please listen to the wine. And you stand there in complete reverence with this glass of something absolutely mind-boggling in front of you, whether it's his Clos Vougeot or his Souchot or his Richebourg, and you feel somehow anointed. And this is how I feel about this 2012 Vosne-Romanee. It's a glimpse into this world. And although there's been the transition to his daughter, who tends to make wines which are much less hard-edged and brutal as he once made. They're more accessible, they're more fruit-driven, they're a little bit more polished. Still, there's a firmness running through them which is very much Griveaux. And I love where the 2012 is in its life right now. Just before this secondary evolution sort of break, still youthful but showing signs of maturity, starting to reveal the depth of the Vosne terroir. Fantastic. Moving to the 2000. If the name looks familiar, Cachou, well, they are. Same family. Just like in Volnay, when you have a handful of names, or in Meursault, where you have a handful of names, Vosne is not so much different. Actually, the mothers of both René and Jacques Cachou were sisters. Two sisters who were the heirs to a domain of their fathers, which basically encapsulated both of these domains. And each daughter married a different Cachou brother. So you have two very tightly knit families exploiting some very similar terroirs with two, however, slightly different interpretations. And Jacques Cachou is also, to me, about as old school as it gets. Certainly rustic, certainly a little more plump and not countryside Burgundy. I mean, it's got some broad shoulders, none of the polish, none of the lace and silk. This is really a different story. But now, as a 2000, the hard edges are smoothed out. The velvetiness is emerging, and you see this very different interpretation of Vosne-Romanée from a vintage which is now absolutely at its peak, was never a huge vintage, was never a bad vintage, was one of those vintages, maybe a little bit like 2017 or something, which just gave a lot of joy, but because of the acidity, also needed a little bit of time to chill out. Then we go back to 1996, now 30 years out. Yes, a village wine, a meager, simple little village wine, which is now monumental at 30 years. But of course, it's from Millau Camusset. Some of you freaks out there might know the name. Simply one of the most historical, important, and top domains in Burgundy. Of course, famous for having its vineyard work overseen by the one and only Henri Jayer. And although Jayer had already departed the domain officially at the start of the 90s, his imprint was firmly left behind, and they really did not change anything with his departure. And as I've known any winemaker or any chef in the kitchen or a lot of CEOs from companies which they built from the ground up, just because you're officially retired doesn't mean you stay away. So even in these vintages, Jayer's presence was certainly felt. And, you know, in the modern hipster culture, people want to insult a judicious use of oak. They want to malign the idea of having very ripe fruit. The idea that every wine should be a pale, limpid color because of its ever so light maceration. It should be picked 8 weeks too early and be green as hell. And God forbid it have oak. And it better be so reductive you can't taste a damn thing other than onion and rotten eggs and sulfur. This is, to me, ridiculous. And although those same people might agree that Henri Jayer was the greatest winemaker of all time, what they probably don't realize, because they've probably never drunk one, is that he was the largest proponent of ample oak, ripe fruit picking, conventional work in the cellar. Of course, impossibly hard work in the vineyard. which is where the wine is truly made. And his wines were round, and they were plump, and they were rich, and they were layered as you would never believe. And long-lived? Absolutely. So with that in mind, this vintage, the 96, a little bit controversial at the beginning because of its high levels of tannin and acidity, were very angular and very difficult in their youth. And the winemakers who knew what they were doing made very, very long-lived wines, as I'm sure you will see this legendary bottling in front of you. Now we come to the two Premier Crus. Now we come to the two single vineyards. I can't say the two Premier Crus because one is not, or at least not the entire vineyard of Vosne-Romanee is. But that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be. You know, there's these gems in Burgundy, which is why knowing the ins and outs of Burgundy, or at least getting a little input from experts, can repay you tenfold, is that there are always these vineyards which are right next to another fantastic vineyard but cost half as much, or a quarter as much, or sometimes even a tenth as much, that share many aspects of the same terroir, which deliver a very similar wine at the end, which age just as well, or almost as well, but don't break the bank. And these are the little in-the-know things. Well, that's exactly what these two are all about. And they're very much in the same line. Now, let's start with the big boy of the box, the Vosne-Romanee Les Sous-Chauds. The Sous-Chauds couldn't be placed better. Right smack in between Romany-Saint-Vivant, Richebourg, and to the north, Échezeaux. I mean, these are arguably three of the greatest terroirs in Burgundy, especially Richebourg. Now, the thing is, where do these vines come from for this bottling? Sous-Chauds can be a little bit like Clos Vougeot. Remarkable? Yes. Top quality? Absolutely. But, like in Clos Vougeot, the vines at the very bottom of that vineyard, cannot be compared with the vines at the top. Different drainage, different depth of soil, different soil, and thus very different wines. Sous-Chauds is kind of like that. When the vines come from the top near to Richebourg, then you can expect that same sort of Richebourg intense structure, sort of strict, if I'm not going to get canceled for saying it, masculinity, robustness, sort of broad-shouldered frame, whereas those down abutting Romany-Saint-Vivant, like Saint-Vivant, more charming, more open, more accessible, more gentle, still incredibly alluring and aromatic. And those, of course, going towards the Échezeaux direction, then get a little bit more flamboyant and sexy and dark. Speaking of which, right below the Sous-Chauds and extending also over into the Saint-Denis part of Échezeaux, you have the Vosne-Romanee. Now, back in the days of Laval and Co., you know, when Burgundy was really being mapped out and for the first time truly understood, and these first critics were trying to sort of categorize which vineyards were truly the best, that the monks all drew up so fastidiously on these crazy maps. Vosne-Romanee was actually considered one of the great wines of Vosne-Romanee because it shares some of the aspects of the Sous-Chauds, but also some of the flirtatiousness of Échezeaux, as it's a smaller strip that extends right over. And there's two areas, the upper and the lower. Of course, the upper is the superior one. This is coming from a fifth-generation winemaker, Bruno Clavelier, who, however, didn't become a winemaker until the early 90s when this famous rugby player, actually, and this is not some stupid celebrity wine, this is legit. He just happened to be a superstar rugby player. He took the domain over from his parents and stopped selling all of the grapes to négociants. So taking it into his own hands and then pushing it into a much more modern sense of biodynamics, low intervention, purity, finesse, and all of these. Preserving the true vineyard fingerprint, let's call it. Similar to Échezeaux, same situation, took over from the parents in the 90s, same story. These two couldn't be more similar in their philosophies, but as with every great orchestral recording with two different conductors, maybe even with the same symphony, same players, you still see subtle differences in the interpretation and the spin that they put on it. So I think you'll see that the increase in the depth and the power as we go from the Village to the Liger-Belair to the Premier Crus just is like going from the runway to cruising altitude. And when you get to the end of the box and these two, you'll truly not just understand the evolution of these wines and the character fundamentally of Vosne, but you'll see why these wines have captivated the most particular of wine collectors since essentially the beginning of wine, and how majestic and enthralling Pinot Noir can be in terroirs like this. So I hope that gives you a nice little overview, or at least great introduction into Vosne-Romanée. Stay tuned. There will certainly be more Burgundy boxes, more Vosne-Romanée boxes, Premier Crus, Grand Crus, you name it, on SommBox. Until then, stay thirsty, and we'll see you next time.